Welcome everyone to the Institute of Medicine of Chicago. Hello, my name is Deborah Hodges and I'm the Program Manager and Association Manager of IOMC. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session. Today's topic is of strong interest as all communities can be adversely impacted by community development, redevelopment, and businesses and activities. If you are visiting us for the very first time, welcome to our monthly virtual program. IOMC has conducted nearly 40 programs, webinars in the last 2 years, and the support and the interest are wonderful, with about 1,300 attendees covering many different topics over the past few months. All of these webinars have one single unifying concept: reducing health disparities. We have a mission at IOMC to achieve health equity in our public health, population health, and community health programmatic series and our own activities. Today's session covers environmental justice and emission standards, the role of health impact and environmental impact analysis. We also will be learning about problematic issues and lessons learned from the RMG Metal Scrap Company from the near north side to Hedgewitch and other projects. As recently as November 15th, the Chicago Tribune reported on how the EPA has engaged Gary, Indiana to track hazardous pollutants. The city of Gary ranks well above the national average in terms of cancer risk from air toxics. Diesel particulates is reported by the Chicago Tribune. The close proximity to a Superfund site raises issues of concern and environmental justice measures, according to the EPA. It is now suggested that all of us, including citizens, help with potential exposures and checking environmental data. On January 26, 2021, the Biden administration launched its Advancing Environmental Justice efforts. This initiative including protecting communities from toxic pollution. There are many ideas and efforts, but more needs to be done. On October 25th of this year, the Chicago Tribune highlighted in an article, Feds focus on pollution in the under-resourced communities, and the USS Lead contamination of soil in East Chicago and the forced evacuation of the West Calumet Housing Complex with more than 1,000 people at that time. At this time, there is successful resolution and the project is being wrapped up, and it involved a low-income population of people of color. Today's topic includes an informative and very well-developed presentation from Dr. Peter Orders from the University of Illinois, and he is a fellow of the Institute of the Medicine of Chicago. If you are visiting us for the very first time, let me share just a little bit of a background on IOMC. IOMC is an independent nonprofit organization of distinguished leaders in the health field who collaborate together to improve the health of the public. IOMC has a diverse membership of regional leaders, and we address critical health issues through a range of interdisciplinary approaches, including education, research, communication of trusted information, and community engagement. If you're not a fellow of IOMC and would like more information on membership, please contact us and check our website for more information. Before we delve into our presentation today, here's a brief update on upcoming programs. On December 15th, IOMC will host a leadership summit and holiday party at the Gage. The topic is going to be on the DCFS, the latest update on addressing youth placement crisis. Our president, Raul Garza, will be moderating this session. Dr. Matt Davis from Lurie Children's Hospital will be joining him. Mr. Mark Smith from the Illinois Director of the Department of Children and Family Services will also be present and part of the panel. And Dana Werner, Senior Policy Fellow and Director of Governor J.B. Pritzker's Children's Behavioral Health and Transformation Initiative. As of as early as in January 2023, we're also going to be hosting another virtual program titled Patient Safety, Healthcare in Nursing Homes, who is keeping an eye on achieving healthcare equity. So today's agenda, in order to orient it, is we have our brief induction. We've talked about our upcoming programs. We're going to look at, enjoy and learn from Dr. Orris in regards to his questions and then his presentation. And then we'll go have a question and answer period. And all of you will be able to place your questions or comments in the question and answer box. At this time, what I want to do is introduce what the learning objectives of today's session are. They are to classify the functions of the environmental impact assessments and health impact assessments. You'll be able to relate how and why they are used. You'll be able to describe their variable impact on environmental health disparities and justice, and also appreciate the importance of both for public health interventions. At this time, I'd like to share some information about our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Orris. Dr. Orris is a professor and chief of occupational environmental medicine for the University of Illinois Hospital and Health Sciences System. He has been attending physician in the Department of Medicine, Cook County Health, for over 3 decades, where he practiced and taught internal and occupational medicine. He maintains an active clinical and teaching practice and holds professorships as well as internal and preventive medicine at Rush University Medical College and the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. His full and very impressive bio can be found on the IOMC website for this program. We're not going to share all of the details, and they are quite remarkable, so that we can have more time today for the very detailed presentation. So at this time, Dr. Orris, I welcome you, and I'm going to turn the session over to you for your presentation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
So it's very nice to be here today, and I appreciate the invitation from the IOMC. We are a cozy group, so I hope you, if you have questions as we move along, that you put them in the Q&A, and as we go through, we can answer any of them possible with on the specifics. This is a usual situation for us who deal with environmental health issues, and speaking primarily to a group of healthcare providers or healthcare policy people who are primarily interested in the structure of healthcare and the social determinants of health as in general. In saying that, is it on a timer? Is that what's going on? All right. In saying that, I want to indicate to you that what I hope to be making a case for here today is that utilizing emission standards alone will not allow us to redress some of the environmental injustices with respect to health that we are experiencing in this country or around the world. And that without an HIA, health impact assessment, being performed on top of and coincident with an EIA, environmental impact assessment, new projects that impact on the environment are unable to be evaluated with respect to the health impacts, and specifically are unable to address the disparities that we already have with respect to the burden of environmental disease, both within our country and around the world. And I underline that this is lessons learned. I will be using some examples from this area, but it's just because they are probably more familiar to you. But these are lessons that are equally applicable and that we have learned from just about all the continents on the world, where there are very similar issues of policy involved, and where there are very similar relationship between the stakeholders and potentially exposed communities and the industrial stakeholders who are proposing new and different developments in those areas. Just the large picture here underlines the situation when we do not pay attention to the potential health hazards. And that is, this is the statue now in the front of the now abandoned industrial plant, chemical plant at Bhopal, India, where thousands of people died due to the release of isocyanate chemicals some years ago, and underlining once again the need to pay attention to the potential health impact of any of these projects that may be going up. This plant is now shuttered, but many of the issues related to the accident on that evening, excuse me, are not yet resolved. Next slide, please. Other than being on the planet with the same kinds of exposures to these potential hazards, I have no conflicts with this topic as a whole. Much of the thinking about the question of environmental health and environmental rights grow out of the 1948 Universal Declaration for Human Rights that we have Eleanor Roosevelt to thank in terms of her lobbying and securing the passage of this precedent and setting declaration on human rights in general, and with the mention in Article 25 of the standard of living adequate to families globally as being a right that people could be expecting. That is the only mention here of the environment, but it still provides a very adequate platform to begin to stand on and to develop, and has been developed in multiple environmental treaties since that time, each one with its own particularities and peculiarities, if you will, with respect to enforcement, winding up now with the climate negotiations and the both Kyoto and Paris process that this past week has had its most recent meeting, COP27, that's the Conference of the Parties 27 in Egypt, as they move through trying to get a handle on climate change. Today, we'll be dealing primarily with toxins and not with climate, but the interactions between the two are marked, of course. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over some basic definitions, assuming that this is somewhat outside of your area of practice, and that is environmental policy in general. We all know what it is, but just to state it for the record, if you will, it's a statement by an organization, either public or private. Primarily, we deal with governmental policies or UN agency policies. And this is of the intentions and principles and providing a framework for action and for the setting of environmental objectives and targets. It takes into account a number of principles and directions that bear stating, and that is precautionary principle, principles of environmental justice, which we are going to be emphasizing today, the need for long-range environmental sustainability, as we have now discovered that the planet itself is limited in its capability of sustaining human growth without our attention to the care of the planet as a whole. And finally, the polluter pays principle, which was characterized by the EPA when it was founded, and the Superfund. We'll go to that in a minute. Next slide, please. The precautionary principle is important to be stated, and that is it becomes quite important when we are considering policy alternatives and projects that have not yet been decided upon or developed. And the importance of it is that at this point, the costs of new projects. When we're considering two projects for the future, the costs involved in those projects are often without thought about the human costs and the human health impact. And that is often due to the fact that developing scientifically reproducible, as in a laboratory experiment, with respect to cause and effect of the new project and human health is often difficult. So the precautionary principle that was first articulated by one of the first environmental treaties passed in Rio in 1982 should be taken into account specifically here, and that is preventive anticipatory measures should be taken when activity raises threats of harm to the environment, wildlife, or human health, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established. Now, that does not mean there are no data on the cause and effect relationship. It doesn't mean that one can proceed without any information with respect to risk involved to human health and the planet itself. But it does mean that we would take a proactive stance when this data would suggest and imply that there were certain human health and planetary health problems with a new project. And the example of asbestos comes to the fore, and that is that despite the existence of such problems and the concern about such problems and the beginning of data about such problems in the 1930s, it was not until the late 1970s that the US and other countries around the world took action to prevent human exposure to asbestos due to its carcinogenic potential. During that period of time, from the 1930s to the 1970s, most of the asbestos use on a global level occurred. And if we had in the 1930s insisted on a safer alternative, the huge costs that have gone into mitigating the asbestos exposure on a global level and thereby reducing the cancers, both lung cancer and mesothelioma and others, would not have been incurred by society. So the precautionary principle is quite important with respect to all of these issues related to balancing risk that go into the ability to form environmental health policy around the world today. Next slide, please. Environmental justice, which we're emphasizing and have been emphasized and are well known to you with respect to justice in healthcare in general, and the disparities that we see in health conditions amongst people in this country, with emphasis on its racial background and additionally the socioeconomic status, but is highly important in this country because of the racial injustices that we see played out in the statistics and disparities in human health outcomes. And while it is poorly defined today with respect to how much of that in this country is due to the differential environments that some groups in the country live in, we are learning more and more of the importance of the environment with respect to that disparity in health conditions that we are seeing, or health impacts that we are seeing. Finally, environmental sustainability, as we all know, is quite important and becomes more important today with the fact that climate change and its differential effects, as we are seeing a warming planet, has been manifested in this country primarily by the extreme variability in weather conditions that we are seeing, both with respect to both cold and hot weather conditions and tornadoes and other impacts of that sort, and the need to prepare for just that kind of variability goes into the concerns about environmental sustainability. Over the last several years, the United Nations has defined what consists of sustainable development and the environment's importance there, as well as other social determinants of health. And this fits within the general discussion that we're having today, but is of course much broader. The polluter pays principle in this country was first paneled into stone, if you will, though not executed quite as well as the original framers of the legislation hoped, but that was included in the original EPA Superfund legislation, in which it was judged that private industry, due to their abilities to resort to the courts and the length of time it took civil cases to be resolved, in which the government tried to get the private industry to pay for the pollution that they had created, needed a superfund that would allow the government to step in, make remediation of those sites, and then litigate for collection to secure those industries that had produced the hazards to pay for the remediation and cleanup over a period of time. It is just that polluter pays principle that is now accepted globally, but not enforced globally. And so in many countries, we see private industry having caused quite substantial problems and exposures to the general population, as well as differentials to populations that are, again, often due to national origin or racial groupings or ethnic groupings and socioeconomic impact. We often see that there is a differential impact in those exposures that has not yet been able to be resolved either by national governments or by international treaties, though important steps have been taken to move ahead on that in the last 20 years or so. And then additionally, one does not want to leave out the global consumer movement, if you will, which has had important impact on many of the multinational corporations, assuring that some of these exposures that in the past were acceptable in impoverished developing countries, but not in Europe or the US or fully developed countries, are no longer acceptable in either place, through the demands of the general public in those countries that have not been able to enforce those demands on or through government agencies. Next slide, please. So, as I indicated, when with deference to Robert Frost, if you will, when looking at policy alternatives on a government level, either local, state, or national, it is critically important to add into the risk assessment both the costs of cleanup, the costs of controls of the potential hazardous exposures, and those costs must include the health and societal benefits from moving in one direction and then not in another direction. And so many of these issues and policy issues are framed in just what are the costs of controls and not adequately within what is the win-win policy of avoiding exposures and reaping the both economic and social benefits of moving in a direction that is more sustainable. This has to include, of course, the costs of just transition, and that is where workers in industries that are polluting and pollute locally and broader speaking than that are retrained and their incomes are able to be reestablished working in more sustainable industries that don't produce this kind of pollution, and therefore not getting into the issue about whether or not the families of those workers should be shouldering the hazards of those industries versus the families of those workers shouldering the economic dislocation when companies just switch on a dime to more sustainable industries without concern about supporting the workers as they make those transitions. Again, that must be included in the polluters pay principles, and that a just transition must be established and secured for those workers as well. Next slide, please. So at the current time, although this is rapidly changing within this country and has changed in other countries around the world, the ability to control pollution is primarily situated within establishing of standards on a societal-wide basis and licensing laws for new initiatives and industry exposures that are based on those standards. And that is a demand that those new industries follow those societal-wide standards of releases into the general environment. And that is the issue that I believe must be changed so that we may move into redressing the historical disparities caused by the current exposures in various communities. Again, that in this country focus on racial minority communities and socioeconomic low socioeconomic communities. And let us move through. I believe the rest of the lecture will make that argument for you based on our experience. Next slide, please. So the first step in establishing a new project in general here and abroad is to conduct an environmental impact assessment. There are various names for this, but in essence, what occurs is an environmental engineering company along with their industrial hygiene components will do a report for an industry that wants to open a new factory, and that report will include an estimate of what the toxic releases will be from that new factory and company. And that estimate will then make a judgment as to whether or not these releases are within the standards created by both the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for the workers themselves or the Environmental Protection Agency for communities and agricultural workers which is under their purview as well. These are, for a variety of reasons, inadequate to address the already existing differentials in environmental justice, if you will, between these various communities. And they are inadequate because, first, the standards are established on an average for the country as a whole, for all communities in all settings. And second, because these standards are often subject to the vicissitudes of which party is in control in Washington and at a state level or even a local level with respect to their attitudes toward industry and the importance of industrial development versus the health impacts being generated by that. And we have seen that all over the country. Perhaps Louisiana was one of the prime examples with the chemical industry all being established on below, if you will, Interstate 10 from New Orleans to Houston, Texas. And when you go south of Interstate 10, and before you run into the Gulf, you are involved in a great deal of the communities that had little economic standard of living, and were based in bayou rural communities that as well had little political power within the state itself, and therefore were unable to protect themselves against some of the emission exposures that the petrochemical industry developed. And that is why we see such a concentration of these industries in that area just north of the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the availability of petrochemicals from drilling within the Gulf itself. Next slide, please. In these evaluations, these EIA evaluations, the result of which is usually this kind of a statement that was done recently, 2018, for a proposal to put in an asphalt plant on the west side of Chicago. And that is the evaluation was done by an air quality services a company that tested and that made some estimates about the concentration and emission rate of particulate matter in this area and some of the releases from the plant in that area itself, proposed releases, if you will, or estimated releases. And then they summarized that the purpose of the test was to demonstrate compliance with the testing requirements of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, and that the releases projected based on these tests from that plant would be below standards required by the Illinois EPA and the US EPA for air standards as a whole. And so this is rather standard testing. This is the kind of testing required by licensing requirements in the state of Illinois, and is really this has been the standard of what has been required prior to the last several years with respect to any of these proposals for new industrial project developments. Next slide, please. And this is the same kind of standards that were placed on the stereogenics plant in Willowbrook, just west of Chicago, over its 20 years of functioning in that community. It was asked to meet the standards of the federal government and state government, and in fact, they met and exceeded those standards during this period of time. And since you've all seen this in the newspapers over the last several years, specifically speaking about the time since 2018, that the issues of releases from this plant became more public. This 20-year development was not a period of time when the owners of this plant, at least the owners of the industrial process, who understood the industrial process, perhaps not the investors, as you will, or the venture capital companies that purchased this plant over that period, but certainly the people who were involved in running the plants in the productive process knew and understood what the potential environmental hazards were, which were both neurologic, but most importantly to the local communities were carcinogenic. This was a period when ethylene oxide was known as a potential human carcinogen, but did not pop up on the radar of the general public because it had not crossed the threshold scientifically of being identified and then agreed to by the EPA as a known human carcinogen, which changed the calculation on the risk involved. And I will trace that through for you. Ethylene oxide in this setting, most ethylene oxide on a global level is used to produce ethylene glycol for car radiators and other coolant products of that sort. That is a product which the industry itself is very proud of, the fact that it is an internal, it is a closed production process, that the workers in the process and the controllers in the process are not exposed to the ethylene oxide itself or any of the reactions that go through making the ethylene glycol. They have extensive health and safety manuals about how to avoid any exposure to the process. The difficulty was that, and is, that 5% of the ethylene oxide that is generated does not go into this closed process, but rather goes into a process of sterilization of a variety of products. But the most specifically that we have become concerned about is the sterilization of products used in healthcare. It is a very effective sterilant for products in healthcare, but that process of sterilizing is by definition an open process, and we'll show you in a few minutes. And I just have on the board here some of the characteristics of ethylene oxide. The other difficulty that this ethylene oxide raises, of course, is that it's extremely flammable and reactive at room temperature. So there must be real care in the use of these chemicals because of this difficulty of flammability. Next slide, please. This ethylene oxide utilized, I've already actually covered this slide, except for the fact that it is treating commercial food processing as well, and spices and seasonings on a global level. The full exposure in those settings is not yet well defined. If we go to the next slide, we bring us back. Many of you may be familiar over the years with ethylene oxide as an in-hospital sterilant. Many of us came into contact with it, as I When I worked with NIOSH in the 1980s, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, as the regional medical officer for the Midwest, we had a number of complaints from hospital workers in different areas, primarily from pulmonary departments, because there were these sterilizers that had been sold for use and put in office environments. They could sit on top of a desk, and they were causing neurologic complaints and others. At the time, we were unaware of quite the extensiveness of the exposures. These were used up until around 2018 in hospitals for sterilizers of this size within the hospital. When you got to larger sterilizers than this, the replacement of ethylene oxide with hydrogen peroxide, which has been replaced in most hospitals within Illinois, perhaps even all by this time, becomes problematical. Next slide, please. When you move to the industrial setting of these large pallet-sized sterilizers, which these hydrogen peroxide sterilizers cannot be used for. So despite the fact that these have been moved outside of the hospitals, still a good number of products and that are non-metallic, that are being sterilized, that are plastic primarily, but there are other materials used, and are used, for instance, to decontaminate and sterilize both respiratory devices, but also are being used for trays for the operating room and others. There are various reasons for ethylene oxide use. It is very effective. It produces a 6-log drop, which the FDA requires in any of the contaminants quite well, and can be used for a variety of products. There are substitutions for each of these products, but the engineering for those substitutes and the approval by the FDA are moving ahead due to an FDA initiative that is developing alternative products, but has not yet solved the question of what do you do in the industrial settings, as you see on the left. Next slide, please. This is just an indication that even when these products have been aerated according to standard, when you open the sterilization unit and then you place these products in a sterile environment for use in the operating room or in other areas, there are residual contaminants that are both ethylene oxide and ethylene chlorohydrin that stay on these products. And those of you working in those settings with these kind of sterilizers understand that, because these are, you can still smell these as coming off of these products, and they have a very distinctive level. Next slide, please. So this is just an indication. It's a very effective product because it disrupts DNA replication on microorganisms and others, etc. It's also why they're so carcinogenic in human beings, and that is that they do the same thing with respect to the development of cancer. Next slide, please. The chronic effects I've mentioned. The primary chronic effect that we are now concerned about, and the community exposures, is the carcinogenic effect. Next slide, please. Due to studies of NIOSH and others in the 1980s through to the 1990s, these have been now elevated from a suspect human carcinogen, which has led to the regulatory levels that you see here, to much more stringent regulatory levels, as in, or rather, the regulatory levels have not move to the more stringent levels that are now expected, because as a known human carcinogen, all agencies of the government and international agencies require the reduction of these exposures within the workplace as low as possible, as technologically feasible, given the capabilities of clearing these substances. The reason for this is, next slide, please, that this has now been defined, I'm a little backed up on my slides, has now been defined, as I said, a known human carcinogen, and particularly of interest because it is one of the few environmental known carcinogens that is directly linked to human breast cancer, an issue of some concern and a significant concern in society as a whole, and which so few environmental substances have been directly linked. This is one of them. Now, if you look at this slide, this is what Stereogenics has been putting out into the atmosphere because of the standards that permitted it during an era that, as I indicated, since the 1980s, this was a probable human carcinogen, but it was regulated not as a known human carcinogen. So what you have here is up to 3,400 pounds of release up until the end of the 1990s, and then it gets reduced by 10% because of concerns of the exposures, but still at a level that releases 3,000 to 4,000 pounds of this material a year, not 34,000, but now down to 3,000 to 4,000. And that was the level of releases up until 2018, when it was noted by the National Air Toxics Survey by the EPA that human cancers were being driven by this carcinogen, by their modeling, now that this was identified by the EPA in 2008 as a known human carcinogen. Next slide, please. So we talked about this moving to class 1, carcinogenic to human. Through the 80s, it was probable carcinogen. And let's go to the next slide. This was revealed to the general public in mid-2018, in the summer of 2018, not by the EPA's technical document that reclassified it, but due to environmental reporting in the Chicago Tribune by Michael Hawthorne, and the calculation based on the National Environmental Health Air Toxics Survey by the EPA of the amount of risk that now communities, and not just the workers, were facing. Next slide, please. That risk then was calculated in this survey, and the levels within the area of Willowbrook that this plant was surrounded by, the residential communities and City Hall, in fact, now revealed levels, next slide, please, that were some, and this was confirmed by actual air monitoring done, but let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please, was at a level that was above the EPA target cancer risk levels, and even above the NIOSH carcinogenic levels in plants. And that is, the EPA would prefer a background rate of no more than one extra cancer per million people from a particular carcinogen in the environment. They believe an action level should be taken when you are at a level of 1 extra cancer per 100,000. And those are the levels, 100,000 at the bottom of the scale that you see that the EPA believes there should be remediation and management. The levels in this community were documented at levels at least 100-fold, above the levels documented as needing management by the EPA, and the OSHA limits, which were the only one extant at the time, other than the Cal OSHA rates, were all another 100-fold above those levels that were now identified as risk, elevated risk to communities as a whole. Now in Illinois, we have an opportunity, though it's a blunt tool, to check what could be those levels and what might they be producing in cancers in the community as a whole. Next slide, please. So that the real, this is still the risk monitoring based on the incremental cancer risk that the calculations of the EPA were making based on modeling data. Next slide, please. And this is a slide that I wanted to look at. In Illinois, we can look at, based on the cancer registries, whether or not there's an elevation of cancer in and around these industrial sites that we are concerned about. It is not very detailed because you can't get smaller than either a census tract or a county. And of course, counties are rather large areas, but using the county levels, and those levels are, of course, impacted by a host of different exposures, so that you would not really expect to see in this setting an impact of a single exposure. But what was found here, if you looked at those counties surrounding the Willowbrook area, was elevated risks based on the actual number of breast cancers and Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is one of the hematopoietic cancers linked to ethylene oxide. So the study results, when taken as a whole, indicated that some cancers were elevated in these populations, and these were cancers that were specifically linked to this particular carcinogenic exposure, which I'm modeling was exposing the community even at the levels that they had been reduced to in 2018 to levels 100 and 1,000-fold above what EPA recommended for backgrounds on the modeling that they had on the air levels on a national level. All right, so obviously all of these health impacts, if you just relied on the EPA levels, recommended levels, or on the OSHA or EPA enforceable levels, would be missed entirely by relying on new projects to only be reduced under those levels that are established for the community as a whole. But worse than that, we see, next slide, that without a human health assessment that takes into account the existing environmental status of communities and the burden, environmental burden that those communities have from existing toxic exposures of a variety of sorts, you don't really get to the full impact of a new exposure added. It's the old question of when is a little more not significant because so much of exposure is already there, or when is a little more just the straw that breaks the camel's back because of all of the exposure there. And that has become the dominant theme in health policy within this country when new proposals for human health impacts are being looked at. And the health impacts are being assessed and related to what is the already existing health, environmental health burden in communities of color and socioeconomic communities of low income. Next slide, please. So this directly impacts upon the current shifting of the RMG plant from the near north side, Lincoln Park areas to the south east side. And this is revealed by utilizing, and I'm running out of time, I see, utilizing a health impact assessment approach that has the basic minimum elements that are generally agreed to for health impacts. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, this is a very large slide, but a very busy slide, if you will, but it seeks to identify one of the critical components for a good health impact assessment, and that is you have to look at the health consequences of the proposed program. In the actual releases, you have to model those releases in terms of risk, utilizing a modeling process that takes into account the actual exposures of those populations, not just the hazards of the chemicals, but tracing an exposure pathway so you understand what the population is actually being exposed to. You need to look at and engage stakeholders with respect to their opinions and understanding of these exposures. That we need to go on to the next slide. That this must take into account the proposal's impact on the health determinants, and health equity. And the health equity has to do with what we've been stressing already. What is the burden on that community to begin with? And I really don't have time to go through the specifics of this, but let's look at the next slide, which looks at this in a more generic capacity, if you will, and that is looking at all of the health impacts in a community that includes obviously the question of socioeconomics and employment and these and the amount and contribution of a new project would make to standard of living in that community if employment was derived from that community, because that's an important part of this measure and social determinants. Next slide, please. Many of these slides are coming from the Chicago Department of Public Health that's involved in a process with local communities, and without commenting on the effectiveness of that process, which is currently under litigation, as well as certainly an issue of some controversy, we can talk some from these slides about what needs to be taken into account, and certainly all agree that there must be an involvement of community members and all stakeholders, certainly the potentially exposed, in these processes. Next slide, please. And we're going to be winding up now. This process, again, all agree must take into account the already existing burdens produced by inequalities and environmental health inequalities generated by a racial discriminatory process, that these exposures have had in the past. Next slide, please. Well, we've talked about that. We're looking specifically at this movement from the North Lincoln Park area to the southeast side. Next slide, please. That these two communities must look at the proposal, or rather, I'm sorry, that we're talking here about what has previously been required for a new proposal, looking at just the new proposal exclusive of where these plants are coming from, looking at the new proposal again, just with respect to how they fit under the general societally rules and controls, are the same kind of evaluation that we identified earlier for the West Side asphalt proposal, and with respect to stereogenics would have missed all and did miss all of the health impacts of the stereogenic plant, even based on modeling data. Next slide, please. And in this community, the EPA is now reviewing this from the point of view of, next slide, please, of all of the elements. Well, I'm good. Next slide, please. I ran over as usual. All of the elements that need to be looked at by the EPA's review, by a health impact assessment review, and by the City of Chicago's Department of Health would agree that all of these components need to be looked at. Next slide, and the final one with respect to this. And with respect to this southeast side, this is the conclusions that the City of Chicago has made, the Department of Public Health has made with respect to the conditions in this community that the plant is moving into already. Next slide, please. This concerns particularly the air quality indexes in those areas. Next slide, please. So back to the beginning and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the importance of the health impact statement as being a statement necessary to remediate the prior inequities in environmental justice and the prior inequities in environmentally produced health impact in communities in the country. If you just use an EIA and use one set standard and just are able to use licensing with respect to the one set standard, you will not be able to address a community that already has a substantially higher level of environmental health burden than the rest of the community as a whole and of the country as a whole when you only apply that one standard of the EIA. Next slide, please. I hope that was not too rushed at the end. I know it was. I hope anybody who would like, we have a small group, so anybody who would like these slides, I am very happy to share them. This is just a short advertisement for the University of Illinois School of Public Health, and specifically the Great Lakes Centers for Environmental Safety and Health that Dr. Buchanan is the director of, and this is a publication they put out recently about how one can use an HIA and EIA to evaluate situations and what tools are available to communities that can be utilized. The Great Lakes Centers and our group here are very happy to be helpful to communities or public entities that wish to know further about this topic. Next slide. Just in case you feel that this is just local, this is a very similar process that we were involved in a few years ago. And this is a hearing with local stakeholders in Nairobi, Kenya, about a process going on about a coal production plant in an energy production plant in Lamu, Kenya. Next slide, please. And I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I appreciate all the places that I was able to take slides from. And I apologize that I have now gone over 6 minutes, and we'll have to cut the slides back on the next episode. Anybody who is able to stay longer, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Dr. Orris. We appreciate that very much. What would you suggest the next steps that people take if they want to become more involved in in pollutants or what's in their particular communities?
Well, it certainly depends on where they sit in the healthcare system and what they're involved with. Some of the steps we've already taken, such as there were 2,000 hospitals in the country with incinerators that were burning toxics in local communities. By now, they have all been removed. There were 11 left in Illinois, and really they are all gone from individual hospitals. It's not quite as good a story as it sounds because some of that was centralized. But having said that, it really depends on where you're at. And one of the things we would like to explore is safer substitution for materials and for processes such as ethylene oxide where possible and where they do not negatively impact on patient care. There is a group called Healthcare Without Harm and a membership group for hospitals called Practice Green Health that have a host of information and practical suggestions about how one moves ahead and away and moves toward more sustainable practices. University of Illinois, Northwestern, U of C, Rush are all part of that, as well as Advocate and others. So if your hospital is not, that's a good group to join for very practical suggestions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Orris, for your presentation. Very informative, a lot of information. We will make this slide presentation available to you if you wish to obtain a copy of that. That's very generous of Dr. Orris. Just contact the IOMC office. We'll be glad to provide that to you. This session was videotaped, so a video will be available in about a week for the public to be able to see. And so thank you again, Dr. Orris, for your presentation. We're highly interested in providing, equity for everyone in our communities who are underrepresented and especially under-resourced. So any kind of intentional engagement in a specific area is very important to take place. Let me just see here. I think a question or two have come up here. All right. So on behalf of IOMC, it was a pleasure to warmly welcome everyone here today, and we appreciate your support. Please feel free to share ideas and on other topics that you may want to see in the near future with IOMC. Just contact our office by email or by telephone. And please follow us on LinkedIn, check our blog. We have a weekly blog we post every weekday, I should say, on trends and news of what's taking place. And also it gives you an idea of what new programs are coming up. So Dr. Orris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good day and a remainder of the week. Take care.
Thank you very much.